special guests. But firstly, congratulations to our authors on the publication of this groundbreaking work, Columbia University in Chile, over 100 years of history. My name is Jennifer Gavin. I'm the library director and senior librarian. And again, I'm so thrilled to welcome you and to have a most wonderful conversation about the book, about all the research that's gone into it, particularly as the library assisted a little bit with some of the research for this work. Carla Magri joined the Columbia Global Center, Santiago, as Communications and Programming Coordinator in May 2021. She has 10 years of experience in corporate communications and media and has specialized in creating content and positioning academic research and knowledge. Prior to joining the team, she worked for 6 years at Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez and for 2.5 years for Chilean-based South American travel company Explora, as well as in printed media. Carla holds a BA in History and a Master's in Journalism from UAI, as well as an MA in Global History in Journalism, from Freie Universität Berlin, and Humboldt University in Berlin as well. She enjoys working in international, diverse, and interdisciplinary settings, and has previously lived in Spain, Australia, and Germany. Nara Milanich, professor of history, joined the faculty of Barnard in 2004. Her scholarly interests include modern Latin America, Chile, and the comparative histories of family, gender, childhood, reproduction, law, and social inequality. Professor Milanich teaches courses ranging from the modern Latin American history survey to a comparative seminar on the global politics of reproduction. She works closely with PhD students in Latin American history at Colombia. She has also taught in and directed the Masters in Latin American Studies based in the Institute for Latin American Studies. Her research and scholarship have been supported by the Fulbright Commission for Educational Exchange, the Social Science Research Council, the National Endowment for the Humanities, UNESCO, and the American Council of Learned Societies. Juan Gabriel Valdés is the Chilean ambassador to the United States. He has served twice as ambassador to the United States, once between 2014 and 2018 during Michelle Bachelet's second government, and now since April 2022 during President Boric government. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Chile, 1999 to 2000. Also served as Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Chile to the United Nations and Ambassador of Chile to the Republic of Argentina and the Kingdom of Spain. From 2004 to 2006, he was a Special Representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations and Chief of the United American Studies from the University of Essex, England. He has a PhD in political science from Princeton and has been a research fellow at Princeton University and at Notre Dame Kellogg Institute of International Relations. He has taught in multiple universities throughout the world. He is a member of the Board of Global Leadership Foundation and the Center for the International Conflict Resolution at Columbia University. He is also the author of Pinochet's Economists, Chicago School in Chile. He has published diverse studies on relations between Chile, Latin America, and the United States. And with many thanks to the Global Centers at Columbia University, Santiago, we are pleased to welcome you and to kick off a wonderful discussion of this evening.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Jennifer, for your introduction, and also thank you to Yandafar and thank you, Nara, for agreeing to be here today and present this book with me. So when I was preparing for this presentation, I started looking through my emails and I found that it was almost a year ago when we first reached out to Jennifer to ask her for help in finding records or pictures or whatever information she could give us about female students that had been studying here during the 20th century. And So she hasn't been able to get rid of me for almost a year, but I promise that it will stop today. So thank you so much for all your help and patience and for organizing this event. Since the first Chilean students that we know of studied here at Teachers College, it made a lot of sense to present it here. So we're very happy about that. And we hope that we can keep collaborating in the future. So what I will try to do is give an overview of the project, to tell a bit about how the idea was born and how we did it, and share a few stories that are featured in the book, but not give away that much. And then I'll hand it over to Nara and the ambassador for their remarks. So the initial idea was born before I even started working at the Santiago Center. So it was in 2020 during the first year of the pandemic, and the global centers had an idea to make available for students virtual internships so that they could work during the summer. And these internships, they did them in companies, in universities or NGOs, and some of them worked at the global centers. So some of the students worked in the initial part of the research for this book. So we had some topics, and then they started doing a bit of research, but then when I joined, that was May of 2021, we started doing more research, and then we found that this history was like much bigger than what we thought initially. So we thought it would be good to like hire more people, researchers and academics, to help us do this properly. So that's how the book got so big, because it was only intended to be like 80 pages or 70 pages, and somehow it ended like that. So yes. So the main focus of the project was placed on 4 main areas. Chileans that study at Colombia and their contributions to the country when they return, Chilean politicians or academics or artists that spend time here as lecturers or visiting professors or researchers. Then Colombia faculty members that have worked on topics concerning Chile or that have mentored Chilean students or researchers. And lastly, the university reaction to the Pinochet dictatorship that, as you know, ruled Chile between 1973 and 1990. Because we didn't know this, but Colombia was a safe space for very prominent political exiles of the dictatorship that are featured in the book, like Enrique Kirchberg. He was a member of the Communist Party, and he was the president, the first democratically elected president of one of Chile's main universities, that it's called Universidad de Santiago. And he was imprisoned the day of the coup, and he spent 2 years in prison. Then someone else called Giorgio Solimano, he's a doctor and he's an expert in human nutrition and public health. Giorgio, he wasn't affiliated with any political party, but he worked for the Allende government. He was in charge of an initiative that was supposed to end child malnutrition. So he was also imprisoned, and after many efforts from different parts, including Colombia, they were both liberated, and they ended up here living for 12 years, and they both taught at Colombia. And also, as the ambassador will tell later, they played a really important part in leading the fight against the dictatorship from here. So those are the main 4 areas that I focused in. And I don't want to give too much away because we wanted to read the book, of course, but I'll give some previews. So, for instance, the first chapter of the book is dedicated to Gabriela Mistral, and all we knew that she had taught at Barnard College in the 1930s. That's everything we knew. But we had no idea, for example, that her first book, that is called Desolación, which was published exactly 100 years ago, wasn't published in Chile, it was published here at Colombia. In 1920, a Spanish professor had been hired by the university to help disseminate the knowledge about Hispanic culture in the United States. And he founded the Instituto de las Españas, which is now a department of Latin American and Iberian cultures. And he was the one that he had heard about Gabriela Mistral, and she had been published, some of her poems had been published in Spain in magazines and newspapers. And he was the one who convinced her to gather some of her poems and make it into a volume, because she had been offered that before in Chile, but she was always she was always very shy and very modest, and she never liked the spotlight, so she hadn't agreed to that before. But somehow he convinced her, and that's how the book was published here, first that in her own country, and actually the original copies of that 100-year edition are here at the Casa Hispanica, which is where that department works today, and there's also a copy at the main library. So that's one thing we discovered. And then another thing completely different was that when she was already very famous and she had already won the Nobel Prize, she was invited back to Barnard to speak at an event that was hosted in her honor. And that's where she met Doris Dana, that was her partner for the rest of her life. So Doris Dana was much younger than Gabriela Mistral, and she was a Barnard graduate. She had studied literature, and she was working on some translations. So that's why she started writing to Gabriela Mistral after they met, and that's how this very famous and controversial relationship began. So there's even more about Gabriela Mistral in Colombia, but you can read it in the book. So, and then the last chapter of the book is dedicated to the diplomatic relationship between Chilean presidents and Colombia. We had records of recent presidents that had been here to teach or to participate in the World Leaders Forum and so on, but we had no idea that this was such a long tradition that started almost 80 years ago, and that it's still continuing today. So, because as you may know, President Boric will be attending the World Leaders Forum in a few hours, so he will be the 9th president of Chile that has visited Colombia. So in some cases, that like the ones I just mentioned, we had a starting point from where to begin a research. But then in other cases, we found topics and people came up as we were researching. And that was the case with Nicanor Parra, who wasn't featured in the book. And actually the book was almost finished, at least in content, and the designers were starting to design it. And I was researching something in there's an archive for the Colombia Spectator newspaper. That is a newspaper run by students, and it's really old, and they have this huge archive, and you can search for really, really old newspapers. And I don't even remember what I was looking for, but I read this article that said that Nicanor Parra had been hired to give a course, like a creative writing course in 1971. And that's when I called my boss, Karen, who is in Chile, and I told her, like, we need to have Nicanor Parra in the book. He's amazing. He won the Cervantes Prize. He died not that long ago. And personally, I've always liked his poetry. So she said, yes, of course. And then I said, like, can I write it? Because I found it. And she agreed to it. So that's why the book took longer to finish, because we had to write an extra chapter and research like everything that was supposed to illustrate that chapter. So this is the last preview that I will give before I hand it over to Nara. But one of the first Chilean students to enter the halls of Colombia, or at least the first one that we know of, was here in 1910, and she was Amanda Labarca, who is very famous in Chile. But when she moved here in 1910, she was not famous in Chile at all. She studied here at Teachers College, educational psychology. But she became a trailblazer in Chile in so many ways. She was the first female university professor in the country, and she, inspired by what she saw here in New York, she created this thing called reading circles, where women were introduced to the debate of ideas and intellectual debates. And she soon became like the de facto leader of the feminist movement in Chile. And then in the following decades, many women, dozens of women, as we found out from the records that Jennifer sent us, many women studied here education in the following decades, and they all came to be very famous in Chile and influenced the destiny of the country in different ways. Like, for example, I had no idea about Graciela Manducano. She was the founder of the first openly feminist political party in Chile, for example. I also didn't know about Corina Vargas, who studied here in 1923 or 24. She came by herself by ship to study here from Concepcion, which is not it's one of the main cities in Chile, but it's in the center south. And at that time, her university was quite new, so no one here knew her university, and they only knew the University of Chile. So she had to convince people that she was okay to study because no one knew her and no one knew her university. But she became the first female university dean in all of Latin America, which was very impressive. And then also Irma Salas, who is a very renowned educator in Chile, she also studied here, and she was one of the main responsible persons for the educational reforms that went on during the 20th century in Chile. So there are 2 chapters in the book dedicated to education and feminism. And though I didn't write those chapters myself, it was still very entertaining and fascinating to read about these women and to see how not only they benefited from getting this world-class education here, but also how this city and everything that they saw and learned here inspired them and made them stronger and sure that they could accomplish great things when they went back to their country. So to wrap up my part, I just want to say thank you to other people who may be watching online. So one person that was really important was Jocelyn Wilk. She is a university archivist here at the library, and she is like an encyclopedia of Colombian history. And she was so helpful. She kept answering to all of my requests, and then she showed me how to search in the archives, and that's how the book got so big, because then I could find stuff on my own, and I kept asking for material. So so it was Jocelyn, and then Socrates. I don't know if some of you know him. He works as a Latin American librarian also at Colombia Library, and he was really helpful getting me papers and like other academic material that I couldn't access from Chile. And lastly, I just want to point out that from the Santiago Center, we know that this book does not cover the whole complete story between Chile and Colombia, but we believe that it's a good glimpse and a good starting point that helps us understand this relationship and this collaboration between Chile and one of the world's leading institutions of education research centers as well.
Somebody else sit here, so I can put over the table, or you want to scoot over for it? I mean, stand. Okay, so maybe I'll scoot up here. Yes, okay. It's a smallish table, but great. So thank you so much to all for being here. So I'm going to offer some remarks about the book. I've read through the lens of a historian of Latin America and of Chile. I hope I don't break the chair in the process. First, I just want to say congratulations to the authors and editors of the book. This is a really impressive work. It's beautifully edited, as you can see. Perhaps at some point we can pass it around. I love the images. I get a sense as I read it of how much fun it probably was to research and to go swirling around in the archives and finding these beautiful photographs and images and making, I think, new historical discoveries that I want to talk about momentarily. So I'm going to focus on the chapters on Teachers College, which is what you asked me to focus on, although I think that some of my remarks could perhaps also apply to other parts of the book. So I think the book makes really abundantly clear that universities can serve as lively hubs of intercultural exchange and interaction for ideas and innovation, right? We get a real sense of that in the chapters. Sometimes those ideas are good ideas, as in the case, I think, of progressive educational philosophy, which is kind of the focus of the TC chapters. It's also true, of course, that universities can be hubs for the transnational exchange of ideas that are perhaps not so good. And the ambassador has, in fact, written precisely about that in another context in another university. But the book does sort of invite us to think about universities as hubs of intercultural and transnational exchange and kind of intellectual thought. The book also makes very clear that for more than 100 years, Teachers College has really been a hub for the transnational circulation of educational ideas and practices. That perhaps is not surprising to those of you who may be affiliated with TC. I'm not a TC affiliate, so it was really interesting for me to read about TC's history. I learned, for example, that in 1920, students from 31 countries, including Chile, were studying at Teachers College. So today, the phenomenon of study abroad, right? The idea of specifically US and universities as international communities is familiar, right? We know that there are plenty of international students and faculty on campuses in this country. But think about this, 1920, this is a new phenomenon. Study abroad is a new phenomenon. The internationalization of the university, I think, is just, I'm not a historian of education, but I think it's just beginning at this time. So I was really struck by that book. So in this book, we learn about TC's influence in fomenting progressive pedagogy and progressive ideas of pedagogy in Chile. And so in my remarks, I want to emphasize the ways that TC has been an incubator of educational philosophies, but not just of educational philosophy, also of political ideas. Indeed, I want to suggest that educational ideas are always also political ideas. That is probably a banal remark for those of you who work on and in the field of education, but I think it bears repeating for the rest of us. Education isn't just about schools or education, it's about society, and therefore it's about politics. So in the case of progressive educational philosophies, for example, I think this claim is particularly clear. Progressive educational philosophies incorporate ideas about gender parity, for example. They incorporate ideas about education as a vehicle for social mobility, for example. They promote democratic and non-hierarchical practices of pedagogy, right, in which the classroom becomes a model for society in general. So in other words, these pedagogical ideas, once again, have political implications. And so it's not surprising, I think, that the educational ideas that TC sort of incubated and that Chilean students imbibed as students studying at TC beginning in the 1920s didn't just stay in Chilean schools when students returned to Chile. Those ideas, I want to suggest, probably also became part of Chilean society more generally. And they also became contested politically. So in reading about this book and where the places in Chile where these ideas, progressive pedagogy, became influential, one such place is the kind of historic liceo in Santiago, Manuel de Salas, which was inspired, I learned, by the teachings of Dewey, faculty member here. And the children of important, sort of by the 60s and 70s, the children of important leftist leaders, Corbalán and others, studied at Manuel de Salas. So this was, an important sort of political center. And with the golpe de Estado, the liceo was taken over by military authorities. Students and faculty experienced the repression of that era. That was, of course, true of many educational institutions, by no means just Manuel de Salas. But one wonders the extent to which Manuel de Salas's identity as a laboratory for progressive pedagogy, for democratic forms of pedagogy, made it particularly threatening to a government enthralled by authoritarian models of, politics and society, thought and action. So we can say, I think, that TC was a vector of educational ideas, but that it became a vector of perhaps political ideas as well, particularly in that polarized context of the late 60s and early 70s, and then moving into the post-golpe, post-1973 era of violence and repression. So we can see this sort of contention that I'm making about educational ideas as political ideas, particularly clearly, I think, in the chapter about the suffragists, right? That this generation of Chilean feminists cut their teeth on notions of female political empowerment and inclusion while studying here in the halls of perhaps Russell Hall. The book shows, I think, very clearly that some of the most prominent feminists in Chile were TC alums, people like Amanda Labarca, Mandujano, Salas, Poblete, Figueroa. For the Chileans in the audience, for the Chilenistas in the audience, these are very well-known apellidos, right? These are las luces, las precursoras, the matriarcas, right? These are the founders of Chilean feminism. And by extension, they are not just the sort of the center of the history of Chilean feminism, but arguably they're critical figures in Chilean political history generally, right? If we assume feminism to be an important part of political history. We knew about Gabriela Mistral, right? There's a fabulous documentary about her relationship to Doris Dana and how they met in Millbank Hall, where I teach my modern Latin American history class. So we knew about Gabriela Mistral's time on campus, but I don't think we knew widely about these other individuals who are also, really important. Mistral is obviously better known outside of Chile because she's a Nobel Prize winner, but these other folks are also very important. So to discover after being in this campus for 17 years, and as being a scholar of Chile, that there are all these webs of connection between Chile and specifically these feminist figures and Colombia was a revelation to me. So thank you for that revelation. And I think that's one of the most important contributions of the book. And I only read the chapters on TC, so maybe there are lots of others, but already there were important contributions. So a good book always gives you answers and new discoveries, but it also leaves you with questions. So I want to end by suggesting two questions that this book kept me thinking about. So the chapters on Teachers College in particular make clear, and I suspect this is true of the other chapters as well, make really clear the influence that this educational experience at TC had on the people who studied here, right? And the influence of TC on Chilean educational development. My question is, what about the opposite? Which is to say, what mark do Chileans, the Chileans who study at TC, leave on this institution and on the realm of educational and in turn political ideas in which they were, of which they were students and in which they became participants? So currents of transnational influence and exchange are never unidirectional. They always go backwards and forwards, right? And while the temptation is always to emphasize how ideas and practices move from the United States to Latin America, the opposite is also true. Latin Americans impact in myriad ways what happens in, from one country to another in Latin America, but also what happens in the United States. I think we could think no further than certain forms of feminism happening in Chile today and their extraordinary impact globally and in the United States as one example of that other direction of influence. So I wanted to know more about that. I wanted to know more about the impact of these Chilean feminists and pedagogues for TC and for sort of feminism in the United States and globally. We know that transnational feminist networks crisscrossed the Americas in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, that feminists from Chile, from Argentina, from Uruguay, from Brazil had met in Pan-American conventions. They discussed, they debated, they argued. They had fights with each other. They imported ideas and exported ideas about policy and legislation from one country to the other. There's a lot of politics of mirroring and sharing and diffusion. I wanted to know more about the contributions of Chilean feminists who studied and TC alums to that realm of ideas. That is obviously a much bigger project than you were, attempting to grapple with. But that's precisely the point: is that a good book is generative. It leaves us with questions. And a second set of questions that I had as I finished reading this book. This book focuses really on the notable people, right? Las luces, the people who are most famous, right? And tells the history through those folks. What would it look like? And that makes sense. Methodologically, that's easier. And for a book of the scope that this is not a critique of the scope of the book. But sort of in a second iteration, when you're working on the 2.0 version, Tomo Dos of Columbia University in Chile, should you decide to do so, I would be interested to hear about the unknown people, the historia from below, of the folks that we don't know, who may also have been extraordinarily influential and important, and went back and were, sort of unsung teachers, perhaps, or pedagogues, and who didn't, lead the feminist movement, but may have been the foot soldiers of that movement, for example. So I would love to know more about disposable, because it sounds like there were lots of Chileans floating around. And again, that is a focus for another book. Perhaps there is a dissertation writer who would like to take up this topic around this table, but I'm going to end there. And thank you very much for your wonderful work, and congratulations on the book.
Muchas gracias. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation to participate in the presentation of this book that I read 3 days ago on the computer. Because I didn't have a
You will have a
volume. I hope I will have one.
Yes.
And I found extremely interesting, fascinating. It was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I was invited by SIPA as a George Paul visiting professor, and I taught here for 1 semester. And I have to say that at the time I had no idea of many of the things that I read in the book, and that are fascinating from the point of view of a university that follows the developments of Chile and participates in all these currents that have become so important in our life. This topic of universities and country and Chile, American universities and Chile, is quite close to me, because I dedicated a long time to research on the relationship between the University of Chicago and Chile. And I published a book called Pinochet's Economists, the Chicago Boys, which in fact has been, even up to now, a book that has been consulted, because I described at the beginning the transfer. At the time, I used the transfer of ideology from a Cold War United States to Chile, in a sense which is quite similar to what the professor was saying about mutual influence. What was transferred to Chile, of course, was, as Professor Harberger told me once in Chicago, we just transferred science. The problem is that those who received it thought of it as an ideology, and they believed that they had to apply it in full terms in a laboratory that had been prepared by a military dictatorship. And I was also very attracted to another university in the States, the California University at Davis, which had an enormous influence, and in this sense, allow me to say, an influence which I think was extraordinarily positive in the organization of the agrarian reform that took place in Chile during the 60s and was launched by Eduardo Frei first and followed by Salvador Allende later on. Some of these professors are alive and well, but I thought immediately that no book has been ever written on the influence that these people had on the agrarian reform in Chile, which was crucial to our development. I have to add that they were expelled from Chile, most of them, immediately after the military coup. But what fascinates me of this book is that it covers so many topics, and it follows, as I said, the currents that are important in our development, particularly the feminist movement. I am in New York now, accompanying President Boric to the General Assembly of the United Nations. And when he describes Chile, he gives the idea that Chile has a parity government, which is something absolutely normal and absolutely necessary. This was not normal in Chile 5 years ago or 10 years ago. There was a very shocking picture that some people were angry. I wasn't angry at all. They showed the first democratic cabinet of President Aylwin and the cabinet of President Boric during President Aylwin's, who was a very respectable Democrat who won the government after the end of the dictatorship. There was not one woman in the cabinet. Therefore, the transformation was extraordinary. We lost a plebiscite 3 weeks ago on the Constitution, and my first reaction was to say, well, okay, we are going to write a new Constitution with a new convention. But there are some things we cannot change. Nobody would dare to change them because they have become cultural changes. And the first one that comes to mind is parity in the convention and parity in the political system between men and women. The second one probably is regionalism. A third one is the concern with the environment. These things cannot be changed in any future constitution because they already belong culturally to what the country feels it is, in the definition of the country itself. Public education. I was very impressed reading the role of Amanda Labarca and of others, of women and men at the time, Corina Vargas, Irma Salas, Oscar Vega, because all of them belong to the public educational system in Chile, and the influence of Colombia in the creation and development of the public educational system during the radical governments of, not radical in the American sense, but in the Chilean sense, gobiernos del Partido Radical, from Pedro Aguirre Cerda to Juan Antonio Ríos. The development of public education was essential to the definition of the country. In fact, before coming to Washington as ambassador, I worked at the University of Chile with the president of the university during the last 3 years, the years of the pandemic and the years of the estallido social in Chile. And the room in which we met is called Amanda Labarca, and it's full of photographs of Amanda Labarca. It is a beautiful room of the old University of Chile, which is close to the rectors, to the president's room, office. Therefore, the idea that these people brought from Columbia University their ideas of public education impresses me enormously. I was not aware of it. On the contrary, I was aware that Gabriela Mistral had been here. And I have to say, Gabriela Mistral has a very close relation to my family. And I knew her personally when I was 6 or 7 years old. And I have pictures with her. And I knew the story of her love from a very direct sources. But what I didn't know was that it was at Columbia University. I knew exactly that it had happened in the United States, etc., etc. To give you an idea of the relationship, my mother inherited a big suitcase of clothes from Gabriela Mistral. Therefore, we always, I remember my mother wearing something and saying, "Do you think I could wear this?" It belonged to Gabriela. Then it impressed me a lot. And I think that the book is very intelligent and subtle and tender in the way in which it describes the relationship, the love relationship, and the way in which these two women love each other. It's very moving. Therefore, not only the idea of the type of the question of women's rights, but the University of Columbia also touches poetry. Poetry is in the essence of Chile. Therefore, the idea of having Gabriela Mistral and Nicanor Parra here is something that is remarkable in terms of the type of relationship that the university established with the country. If we follow with astronomy, which is another characteristic of Chile, which is very unique to Chile in terms of the way in which we have developed astronomical observatories in the north of Chile, in which the United States, the European Union, Japan, and other countries participate, and that Chile gave away this land in Atacama in order to have the possibility for astronomy students to use these astronomical centers to develop astronomy in Chile. Maria Teresa Ruiz, with whom I studied at Princeton, came here later on, and she was an extraordinary attraction to other young people to enter into the field of astronomy, which was not, of course, a field for a country that is in development, a developing country that has not many resources in order to develop technology in this area. Therefore, this association is very critical. And then comes the issue of politics. I was here, we were here, as students and exiles, Chilean exiles, when Enrique Kirchberg came to Colombia and Giorgio Solimano came to Colombia. And we were together permanently. We worked together in a very important area, which has not been described, has not been written, which is the campaign against Pinochet at the United Nations, which is something that had an enormous importance because it led to the creation of Chile Democrático, an office in New York, where there were 4 of us working. I was finishing my studies at Princeton, therefore I could travel to New York without being seriously penalized. And I worked with them in the organization of all the human rights commissions that were created at the UN, and the votes, the big votes at the General Assembly condemning Pinochet for human rights. And the elders in our group were Enrique Kirchberg, of course, and Orlando Letelier. And we consulted these 2 persons and also Giorgio Solimano, who came at the time. Giorgio was younger, of course, but he was not young as us, as we were at the time. We saw him as a professor and we were only students. But this group of Chileans were directly linked to Colombia. We visited their apartments, we had dinner with them, and we came to the university sometimes to listen to them or to see. I remember the program that is very well mentioned in the book, the program that Giorgio Solimano developed with Cuba at the time on children's health. Then the book underlines the enormous generosity of authorities of a university which were able to receive somebody who was accused simply because he was communist, and that didn't care about his general ideology, because the university accepted and as an essential belief freedom of speech and freedom of thought, and therefore he was allowed to stay here, and the book underlines that too. Even if the State Department made all sorts of inquiries of why he was staying here and why he was allowed to stay. At the time, we had a permanent preoccupation of being thrown out because of what we were doing. But the solidarity of the American people, most of the American people, was extraordinary. Next year, there will be 200 years of the relationship between the United States and Chile in diplomatic terms. It was in 1823 when the first American ambassador came to Chile and presented credentials. But we will also commemorate 50 years of the military coup. And then I have been, of course, involved in the discussions and in the conversations of how are we going to do it. And I propose something that I hope it will work, because obviously the names like Henry Kissinger or Richard Nixon will show up. There's no way to relate the Chilean history without mentioning them. But at the same time, I would like to mention the fact that it was on the basis of what happened in Chile that most of the human rights movement in this country developed. WOLA, Washington Office on Latin America, Amnesty International, that hadn't looked at Latin America until then, and many other organizations in Washington, in New York, developed on the basis of what had happened in Chile. And it was these organizations linked to universities, but with none other more linked than with Colombia, allowed us to develop our activities in New York with freedom and without major dangers. I think this is extremely important to mention. Therefore, when you look at the book and you see that women's rights, poetry, astronomy, chemistry, neurotechnologies were initiated here by many people who were extremely important in the development of these areas in our country, you see that the relationship of this extraordinary university and Chile is really something that deserves a book like the one that you have worked on. And I want to congratulate all of those who have been linked to it, because I think it opens a new world in terms of what a relationship between two countries as close as these are. And for diplomats, it forces us to look not simply at the governments, but also as the way in which civil societies link to each other. Therefore, thank you very much for having me today. Congratulations.
So I don't know if anyone wants to say something or maybe ask questions, and we have a little time for. Yeah. So.
The organizers of the book, I hope there are copies available. I missed to whether or not we can get them easily enough.
There are some copies, but it will be available to download from our webpage for everyone. We didn't print that many copies, and we can't sell them. So.
Just quickly on the points, really this is picking up the investors' comments now about the dictatorship. And the Chilean Commission on Truth and Reconciliation, I don't know if that's what name you remember, was probable only to the efforts done in South Africa.
That's right.
And it really helped to put names and dates and what happened to kind of common people that now referred to as Marx, and I think that's had a dramatic effect on Chile ever since. We knew these people, where they were, they disappeared, what we knew about regular taken, exhumed their grave sites in many cases. So that was a wonderful book. And I'm wondering, Carla or anyone, if that's something that record of that period, did Colombia have anything to do with getting those records, which great to have them, but they were very precariously held in Santiago. There was great fear that the government would swoop in and take away what records were there. How was, did Colombia play a role in that, Mr. Ambassador, or
as far as I know, no, but also we didn't get involved exactly in that topic for the book. But if we continue researching, and also no, because we have to think about, that's something that we have to think now, is to plan what we're going to do for next year's 50th anniversary of the beginning of the dictatorship. So that may be something. We still have to decide what we're going to do, but we need to do more than one thing at least. So, but that's a topic that I'm very interested in. So for sure I can. Okay, we can work together. Anyone else?
I know that Chile had a big role in the Alliance for Progress. I'm wondering if there's a Colombian component to that.
Not that I'm aware of in the book. We do mention it because President Frei Montalva, who came here in the 60s, and he participated in Franz Tannenbaum's university seminars about Latin America. He was involved, but that's the only chapter that mentions.
Which was ambassador here.
Oh,
Washington.
but I didn't.
Tomic was appointed by Frei as ambassador in Washington.
And Tomic also came here with Frei. He also participated in the Latin American seminars. I believe it was 1962 when Frei was senator and Tomic was ambassador, and they both spoke here about Latin American issues. That I found out. I had to go to the Casa Museo Frei Montalva, and they let me research in their archive and found letters, and mostly letters inviting me to speak to Colombia for a few months. So it was really interesting.
My name is Gabriel, and I work at the journalism school. I'm also a graduate of that school and a graduate of college. And I've been closely, I think, affiliated with the university for 30 plus years, partly because I've always felt that the university has stood on the right side of history, whether it was apartheid or Pinochet or fossil fuels, even if it took a while to get there. And that always made me feel that this was a place that I could believe in. With the rise of authoritarianism particularly all over the world, particularly in Latin America, I wonder, within the context of where we are now, what role university can play in raising awareness and finding solutions to a path out of this trend. When you mentioned the 50th anniversary of it brings to mind a lot of opportunities to renew these relationships. We have just, I think, one student in Chile at the journalism school, but journalism and in particular free press issues are so threatened now that I'm most sad that Lee Bollinger is leaving the university because he's been such a champion for it. But what do you think about sort of this new chapter of how this tradition will continue, and particularly in this battle against authoritarianism in Latin America?
Are you there to me? Yes.
To anyone,
I think that universities play a very central role in these issues. I think that universities are the only places where we can think and discuss our tragedies that are ahead of us. I mean, the United Nations meets each year, and you hear speeches, and you have then the personal conversations between the presidents. But I can tell you that, for instance, what I will not mention names, but some presidents say in public, and some presidents say in private. It's two different words. I was yesterday at a meeting with the European president in which he said, we are facing the extinction of humanity. He didn't say that in the speech at the UN, but he's perfectly convinced that we are facing the extinction of humanity as a result of the environmental crisis and the warming crisis. Where do you discuss this, if not at universities? And where do you find solutions for it? I think that this is something that is becoming critical, and it has an impact on universities, of course, because it is not the type of approach that probably we have in academic terms at university. There is a big question on how are we teaching? What are we teaching? And this is a topic that I think is fascinating. The same with democracy, because as you said, democracy is being threatened every place. And the situation of freedom of speech is becoming an exception. In Latin America today, there is a tendency towards authoritarianism, which is extremely worrying. And this is why, for instance, we believe that a government like the one in Chile has to succeed, because what follows, we have no idea what will come, what could come. And we see the situation in Brazil, and we see the situation in Salvador, and we see different models and forms of authoritarianism that are extremely dangerous. Universities debating that and discussing that, I think, is extremely important, particularly in this country.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think we need look only no further than the attacks on academia and academics and universities in this country right now to understand that they in fact be important places for the free exchange of ideas, for the valorization of empirical evidence to make claims, right? The press is clear, universities are another space of debate and exchange that I think are rarely under attack today. So, I mean, I think that speaks to their role or potential role. I do think that it is always the job of students and faculty to keep administration honest and to make sure they walk the walk and don't just talk the talk. I think Colombia sometimes talks the talk and it could do a little more walking. It's a large and very complex university. There are many things going on at any one time, many people, many institutes and centers, and right. So I think it's impossible to sort of summarize, say Colombia is always on the right side or it's always on the wrong side. I think it does great on some things, and there are other things that we could do better on. And I think it's, and that's true of any university, right? And I think it's really the job of students and faculty to keep the university honest. And there is a history of doing that in Colombia and the protests of the late 60s. And of course, here we could also look to places like Chile, where students and faculty and the university has been a center for keeping the political class honest, as it were, and true to its principles.
I just wanted to say something about what you, as a journalist myself, I'm a firm believer in the freedom of press. I think that's essential in any democracy, but I have been getting increasingly worried about the quality of what we consume that has been published in media lately. So I think also there's some other criticism that journalism schools need to address, that they play a huge role in ethically how are we educating these people that are going to inform us. So as much as free press is an essential part of democracy, the quality of that press is also an essential part of democracy, because we know and we've seen so many times what fake news, or I won't say like other words, but like bad quality of what we get can diminish democracy. And I think that's very dangerous. And that's something that universities should also be worrying about, I think. Anyone else wants to say something? No. If not, I think we can leave it here, because I guess almost everyone is going to the World Leaders Forum now. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming.